The beeping was steady like a metronome, indifferent and exact. It counted breaths for a man who could no longer keep his own. I learned very early to hear things backwards. A slow rhythm meant the end was near. A staccato meant panic. A flat line was someone else's fault. Tonight the beeps kept time with my heartbeat. Dad's hand, the one that had once signed contracts with the flourish of a man who believed in architecture of industry, lay limp and paper pale under the thin hospital blanket. The tubes looked sacrilegious, the sterile light unforgiving. There was a postcard stuck to the wall from a charity gala he'd been photographed at 3 years ago. Him smiling, hand around Mom's waist. A different man. The portrait I grew up with, sober, unbending, proud, was not the man in this bed. Clara's Instagram showed a different truth. Sunlit cocktails from a resort in Bali. Laughter frozen like a promise. Oliver had a new flat in Dubai. Palm trees in his banner image. A smiling Madeline curated on LinkedIn. Accomplishments neatly framed. They were together in color and filters. He was alone in grayscale. When the nurse left the room, closing the door with hushed authority, I let my shoulders drop. I had flown in yesterday. I had meant to let revival take its natural course, private visits, reconciliations, the usual ritual of adult children, with busy lives rediscovering their roots. But I had seen the bank app the week before. I had seen the invoices with Clara's signature that drained Heartline Logistics into accounts in Indonesia and Belize. I had seen the charity checks that were routed through shell companies. Denial is a warm bed. I was done sleeping. There is a kind of decisive cold that settles when you know what must be done, and know that doing it will fracture more than bone. My father trusted me with a set of papers after a conversation in his study 2 winters ago. He called it a safety rehearsal, but in the tight certain way he had, he put the key details in a lockbox with instructions. "When the time comes," he said, a tremor in his voice he covered with a half smile, "if they make a mess, you clean it. Not with insults, with law and accounts." I had laughed then. I'm not laughing now. The beeps continued. I signed the forms Mr. Reynolds handed me in a tense, small script. Power to freeze accounts, contact the auditors, place holds on property transfers. He looked at me and nodded. "You sure?" he asked. I was. Outside, a storm gathered like the rest of the world wanted to be as certain as I was. Inside, the air was thin and tasted of bleach. I took the beeping machine for what it was, a clock my family had ignored. I did what fathers teach daughters to do in secret. Between bedtime stories and boardroom lessons, pull the emergency brake and take the wheel. I remember the moment not as triumph, but as an incision. Precise, necessary, difficult. This is a story about what I did with that incision, how I navigated the quiet ruin of a family, and the way silence can be both weapon and refuge. It is the story of how the woman who'd left to learn the world came home not to be rescued, but to rescue something that had once depended on her. Evelyn Hart, I left a city of gray trains and borrowed apartments for a weekend and stayed for weeks. London had felt like a dress you wore for evenings, flattering, useful, temporary. When I boarded the flight to Manchester, I packed a different suitcase, one with documents, a notebook, an old fountain pen. My father used to say that documents remember, people forget. I took paper to make memory honest. The airport smelled of coffee and rain. I sat between 2 women who argued about yoga classes and a man who fell asleep with his mouth open. Privately, I rehearsed how to say what I had to say. I imagined the sequence as if it were a ledger, facts down one side, consequences down the other. Thomas Green, our lawyer, had been waiting. He had that unflappable half-smile that looks like the sea when someone talks about storms, present but not alarmed. At home, the house looked less like mine than a film set. There were still family paraphernalia, Dad's cufflinks, the clean lines of his desk, but something rational had been rearranged into exhibitions. Signed prints of Clara's public columns hung where my certificates used to be. Faces smiled out of frames with carefully curated light. My father's study door was closed, and I realized my chest tightened at the thought of opening it. The night he fell, it had been Oscar night on the television. Claire, my mother, had insisted they watch the spectacle together, though they'd barely spoken that week. The next morning, James Hart, or Jim, as the market papers called him in chum-friendly eulogies, before we had reason for eulogies, collapsed. The cause read at first as a simple cardiac failure, but hospitals are also places that accept bills, and bills in our house had started to miss their due dates. "How long?" I asked, when Thomas and I sat across from each other in the living room, the heater clicking softly like a watch. "Months," he said. "There are transfers that don't match any charitable disbursements in the ledger, shell entities, offshore accounts, some personal purchases appearing on corporate ledgers." He met my eyes. "And the family charity, well, it's been used as a pass-through." I felt lightheaded, not at the idea of loss, but at the acceleration, the quiet line on the spreadsheet that crescendoed into an abyss. "How did they—" "Clara had access," Thomas said. "She was in every board meeting after you left. Oliver had signatory rights on some of the accounts. Madeline managed communications. It looks coordinated." Coordinated was a word for orchestration, by people who never had to see the faces of those they harmed. Coordinated sounded professional. Coordinated began with a person's permission. I told him to do what the papers in my coat had always promised, the ones my father had left in case of emergency. I told him to freeze accounts. He hesitated the way a man does when he calculates the temperature of a room and guesses at the hunger beneath it. "Are you ready?" he asked. I thought of waking up early, of my father humming as he brewed coffee at 4 a.m, an old man's domesticity that smelled like purpose. I thought of the evenings when Clara had hugged me in some glitzy lobby and whispered, "We need you to return soon," as if it were a prophecy. I thought of my brother's photos from Dubai, with palms and an expensive smile. I thought of my sister's neat posts about balancing philanthropic aims with practical tenderness. I thought of my father alone in the hospital bed. "Yes," I said, "I'm ready." The first call I made was to the bank. The woman who picked up cool, courteous asked for details I had penciled on a scrap of paper. Account numbers, recent transactions, descriptions. I read slowly, as though reciting from a prayer book. There was a pause at the other end, always a pause when people realize that legal procedure rests on human choices. "I'm going to place a temporary hold," she said. "We'll need the authority in writing. Can you come in?" I walked into Heartline's offices the next day, like a ghost returning to haunt the place he'd built. The reception was newer. The leather chairs had been swapped for chrome and glass. A portrait of my father had been replaced by a print of Clara smiling at a podium. Employees checked me with that polite curiosity people give to children who have come to reclaim something. "Evelyn," said Mark, the head of finance, when I found him. He was older than most of the suits I used to see in the boardroom. Steady, competent. When he saw me, he paused, as though he had expected a different daughter. "We've been expecting you," he said, and it had the softness that precedes good news or terrible. The ledger was thicker than I expected. It felt like touching the spine of a novel whose author had lost interest halfway through. There were entries labeled Donation HF Trust Bali, with suspicious routing. Payments for consultancy fees that landed in accounts traced to a name I knew, Clara Hart Consultancy. Unexplained payouts to a P.O. box in Belize. The sums were not petty. They were choices presented as inevitability. "Explain this," I said, tapping a line item with the pen I'd brought. "Corporation funds to a personal concierge in Jakarta?" The last absurdity ought to have made us laugh. It didn't. Mark's face shifted, a teacher telling a student the answer she already knew. "We're in the process of conducting an internal review," he said, "but there are power of attorney documents Clara present in some files." Madeline called the next morning with the quick, clipped voice of someone who thought every question was directed at her seat at the table. "Eve, what is this about? Dad wanted us to expand the charity. He told us to be flexible." "Flexible is not a synonym for disappearing millions," I replied. It escaped me. I regretted the tone. But Madeline had the practical air of someone who never wanted to be interrupted in the middle of her performance. "You're being dramatic," she said. "I'll speak to Mom." I hung up and opened the box my father had left in his study. He had locked it and put the key in my pocket that summer, an odd intimacy our family had never awarded in words. The envelope inside contained a single sheet of paper and 3 directives: freeze, investigate, protect. My father trusted me with a surgical incision. I would use it now, with his consent sewn into it. "Where are Oliver's transactions?" I asked Mark. He pulled up more entries. There were payments listed as equipment, consulting, travel, bureaucratic loopholes that functioned like applause, noises that mean nothing but make people feel important. The cumulative tally made something cold in my chest expand, the deliberate funneling of a man's life's work into a handful of people's leisure. There was no clean moment to reveal truth. There was only the act of unspooling, emails, scanned invoices, an offhand message from a PA that read, "Funds wired as requested. Funds wired as requested." Each message, a small, casual theft, repeated until it felt ordained. I slept badly on a couch in the office that night. The city outside was indifferent. I had built a list that would bend rivers. It needed names. I made those names. You never get used to the sound people make when they realize the ground beneath them is gone. Madeline's voice shattered first. It was the strangest sound. Not rage, but a high, brittle panic, as if her professional calm had been a paper lantern. "Eve, what are you doing? You can't freeze the accounts. Think about payroll. Think about the employees. If this goes public, the company collapses." "Maybe making it public is the cure," I said. "Maybe letting them know that money meant for families has been siphoned into vacations is what's going to force the truth out." She spat something that sounded almost like prayer. "You're killing Dad's legacy. Do you want that? Do you want our name to be mud? Do you want to be family thieves?" I replied, "because I can't be complicit." Oliver's fury was quieter, but it landed with heavier consequences. He flew in from Dubai with a lawyer and a statement about misunderstandings and creative accounting. He sat across from me at my father's bedside with all the arrogance of someone used to curtains being pulled back at his command. "He's my father," he said. "You can't just—" "I have the power of attorney," I said. "He signed these documents. He trusted me. He made a plan. When you found a Patek Philippe and couldn't explain it, did you ask him? Or did you write another line on the company's books?" He flinched at the last. There is nothing crueler than the truth when it lands at home. When the story hit the press because of, not in spite of, our actions, Clara appeared as if on stage, interview ready. She wore the same pearl earrings she had on every gala night, those round, luminous things that made light feel soft. The cameras loved soft. The cameras loved nothing as much as scandal wrapped in velvet. "Clara Hart has a statement to make," she said from a hotel suite, smiling like someone who had long learned to present grief as a brand. "Our family is devastated. There are rumors and inaccuracies. I will cooperate with authorities." It was the tactics you'd use with a PR team. Center the narrative, control the tone, moderate the anger. But the ledger does not care about tone. The ledger only cares about numbers. And numbers counted. Employees whispered brasilely in corridors. People who had been with the firm for decades came into my office with hollow faces, asking if they would be paid. A man named Sewell ran a warehouse team and spoke of loyalty to Jim Hart as if to a saint. He had piles of earned wages between him and the week. He asked me quietly, "Will there be enough left for the men?" "We owe them everything," I said. "We will fix it." That night, we issued statements and brought in auditors. We held a press conference where I read a carefully worded paragraph about stewardship and accountability. I thought of the hospital bed and imagined him watching how we choose to perform. He had loved the business, not for ticker symbol value, but for the people who loaded trucks at 3 a.m. It was time to save the people. Revenge, I learned, is not theatrical. It is administrative. It is the slow knife of truth cutting through rot. Auditors are the gardeners of failing things. They don't speak much. They trim. They measure. They pull. We hired the cleanest, most impartial audit firm in London white shirts, patient eyes, the kind of people whose job is to not be noticed until the weeds have been removed. They found donations that could not be traced to beneficiaries' money sent to an address in Bali that belonged to a company registered in the name of Clara Hart Consultancy, a string of payments for consultancy that were invoices for spas and villas. One of the invoices even bore a photograph of a private boat. When I held the paper between my fingers, it felt like a confession. "How did you not see this?" Mark asked at one point, exhaustion making him speak in jolts. "You didn't look for it either," I said. Employees filed complaints. The charity board was dissolved. The foundation's assets were frozen. Watching people on television say, "I had no idea," felt like watching actors run through your life unknown. I wanted to be sympathetic, but sympathy is a currency. I wanted to redirect it back to the workers, the pensioners, the men who loaded pallets. There were threats you expect them when money gets called out. There were lawsuits filed by my siblings claiming undue interference, calling me impetuous, hasty, self-interested. They hired teams of lawyers with new suits and practiced indignation. But lawyers, like auditors, move at a speed both maddening and necessary. We filed with the regulators. We sent subpoenas. I sat at a desk and made lists, names, emails, bank transfers. There were nights I did not sleep, reading through transaction logs until dawn lightened the edges of my screen. My father's condition oscillated between lucidity and fatigue. On good days, he griped about the hospital food. On worse days, he slept like he had been emptied of worry. He recognized me sometimes, called me by the name his mother gave me, Evie-like a small blessing. Once he grabbed my hand with a strength that surprised him and mouthed, "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," I said, my voice softer than I felt. "There's more." He nodded, a small, weary soldier. The regulators seized assets. The boardroom was emptied of those who'd taken what wasn't theirs. I watched exteriors of houses sullied with drizzle and felt none of the cold it promised. I watched the top-floor windows where Clara's socialite friends had once toasted. One by one, they softened into quiet. People have an economy of shame. It's hard to spend until the accounts are called. Yet the personal cost began to calcify. Madeline texted the kind of message designed to prick rather than plead. "You can't burn the family to save the business." She wrote it at 3 a.m, public anger disguised as private. Oliver called once and then disappeared. There are men who run when the water touches their knees. I stood at the hospital window and watched the city continue cars, lights, the indifferent markets. The ledger's line items glowed faintly in my memory, like constellations. I realized that to save something, you often had to strip away everything else around it that had become a parasite. I realized I had to become a surgeon in a room full of relatives insisting on bandages. I used to hate cameras. I thought they made people perform grief as if it were a dress. Now, I use them as a penlight exposing, not flattering. We called a second press conference, and I spoke for an hour about corporate governance, about modern charity accountability, and about the difference between stewardship and entitlement. Someone asked me, "Are you not afraid of what this will do to the family?" I paused. There are questions meant to trap you into moral equivalence. "I'm not afraid," I said. "I'm aware, and I'd rather be blamed than complicit." The choice between two things is sometimes just that. A choice. I chose transparency. The headline reaction was swift and predictable. Some outlets called it family drama, others white-collar fraud. The charity's donors demanded refunds. We offered restitution. We opened a fund. Saul and his team received one of the early disbursements because he had asked for small things. Proper gloves, not excuses. Clara offered statements of shock and betrayal, but she also retained counsel and prepared for combat. She began giving interviews about misinterpretations and the cutthroat nature of corporate life. It was theatrical, But then much of modern life feels scripted until it is not. Madeline went on a podcast about rebuilding trust and used phrases like loyalty and years of work, as if years of work begged for moral exemption. Oliver released a piece in a business magazine about vision. The spin cycle is a form of denial. At night, I walked the hospital corridors until the janitor, a man named Paul, would find me and offer cheap tea out of habit. He had a simple theory: people don't break things on purpose. They just forget the person on the other side. Keep making noise, he told me once. Noise wakes people up. So I made noise. Transparency reports, town halls for staff, individual meetings with families of long-term warehouse workers. One woman, named Eliza, brought me a small cake one afternoon. "For telling the truth," she said. Her hands were flour-streaked, her eyes tired but grateful. I cried that night in the hospital parking lot in an uncontrolled, grateful way. There is no sweeter thing than proof that your work restored someone else's peace. But the family couldn't be so easily fixed. At home, the phones stopped ringing with summer invitations. Christmas would once again be taught us as a rehearsal in community. Now silence served as ill-fitting armor. People who had once broken bread with us found it difficult to acknowledge our table. They texted in ways meant to be casual, but were not. Small barbs, reminders, financial, not quite please. I found a private message on Clara's social feed, a tiny vine of resentment. "You always did like being in control." She had a point. I liked being in control of truth. There is power in knowing how the world is arranged and choosing the rearrangement. One night, sitting on the hospital bed with my father's hand in mine, he looked at me like someone handed the map to his life and asked him to approve. "You did good," he said. "You always were." He stopped and coughed, an old man battling for grace. "You were always the steady one." "Not steady enough," I joked, but there was no laughter. He squeezed my hand like a benediction. People assume that telling the truth absolves you. It does not. There are claws beneath the words you speak, sharp and private. Madeline sued me for control of the charity, arguing my actions were reckless and dangerous. She filed for emergency injunctions to unfreeze assets. Oliver accused me of fabricating evidence. Clara accused me in the press of using father's illness to stage a takeover. All of it was like people moving furniture inside a burning house. The structure was damaged. They were arguing about who placed which painting on which wall. I walked through the flames and thought of cooling things with wet hands. The lawyers fought in the sterile language of contracts. There were court filings and stormy depositions. I found myself in rooms of fluorescent light where men in suits explained the problem in terms of fiduciary duty and board oversight. I sat through hearings where we argued whether my father was competent when he signed the various documents years ago. The question of intent is a scalpel. The court is sterile and slow. When the judge asked my father, he rested his head back and said, weak but clear, "I know, Evie. I left it to her because she understands. No theatrics, no flourish." A quiet line that hammered things. The judge nodded, and the court's momentum shifted like the tide. My siblings' resentment hardened. The holidays were canceled. Family friends chose sides with the casual cruelty of people who will not know the person behind the headlines. Invitations dried up. I lost things you don't miss until they are gone. Brunches, small confidences, the patronage of people who enjoyed showing off their neighbors' tragedies as ornaments. There were letters, a curious number of letters. Anonymous notes slid under the law firm's door. An envelope arrived with a photograph from an old holiday with me as a child. The handwriting on the back said, "You were always favored. Gifts meant to sting." I thought of my father in the hospital, his breath measured by the machine. He was already paying the price. I was forcing others to pay a price they had prepared for themselves. The ethics of retribution are rarely tidy. You save something only to watch the landscape of your life rearrange. You must then decide whether the cost was worth the salvage. For me, the tally was quiet. I chose to keep the people who mattered, workers like Saul, nurses like Mira, who stayed overtime, small contractors who had trusted us for decades. I chose to let go of the creaking social structures that had been polite enough to conceal theft. That is not noble. It is necessary. The charity's audit results were made public. The numbers were raw and final, like a bone laid bare. Clara's consultancy accounts were traced, offshore accounts frozen. Oliver's payments were publicly linked to luxury purchases. Madeline's PR firm had built the foundation for services they could not account for. They denied at first. Then, like men left to face a slowly rising tide, they conceded lines in private, called their friends and lawyers, and attempted to salvage stories. Retirement homes accept new names on plaques. Corporations accept new leadership. The structure remained, but with fewer decorative flourishes. It took months for the regulators to press charges. Clara faced civil litigation for misappropriation. Oliver was investigated for money laundering. Madeline had to testify about processes she could not fully explain. It was ugly and legalistic and intimate in the worst ways. Families are prisons. Courtrooms are the keys. One afternoon, after a long deposition, I went to the rooftop garden of the hospital. The air was thin and smelled like rain. I sat on a bench and watched a pair of nurses pull a puppet of a child in a stroller past the emergency door. A small act of joy. A man in a hard hat walked by and tipped his hard-earned cap to me without knowing why. The city looked like a stitched quilt, gray and human. My phone buzzed. A text from Madeline. "Are you happy now?" I thought of replying with logic and law, with ledger entries and receipts. I thought of the quiet beeping of the ventilator. Instead, I typed, "I did what I had to. I do not know whether I'm happy. I am at peace in a way that is unfamiliar to me." Days later, the Foundation issued a public apology and pledged reparations. We set up a program prioritized for long-term employees and affected families. We returned funds where we could. We held town halls. We apologized to people who had nothing to do with the greed and everything to do with the work. They clapped when I spoke because this felt like repair. But repair is not the same as resurrection. Our family, after the wounds were exposed, didn't stitch back together, it rearranged. My siblings drifted further into expendable silence. There is a peculiar kind of grief in watching people you loved become small. If my father were a tree, and we discovered rot in its trunk, we would have cut away the branches that threatened its life. This was surgery. One evening, Dad woke and said, "You saved the trucks." "What?" I said, amused. "The trucks, they matter, and the men." "Did you fix the men?" "I fixed what I could," I said. He turned his head slowly toward me. "You did more than you know, Evie." He said the nickname like a benediction. He would not be a man who spoke much of mercy. He was a man who understood work. To his way of thinking, I had done the job he would have done had he been able. In the months following, I found small things to hold on to. I visited distribution centers and watched men unload pallets in the rain with stoic concentration. I saw Sewell in a fluorescent vest, teaching a young hire how to measure boxes. Whatever else Heartline had been, it was a promise to those men and women. My job, as I saw it, was to keep that promise. We created a structure of oversight, a board of independent auditors, and employee representatives. We instituted transparent reporting systems, allowing employees to see fiscal statements. We added a hotline. We revamped the charity to be donor-driven, not influencer-driven. It was the kind of tedious detail work that saved lives in ordinary increments. At home, rebuilding meant different work. My father's recovery was slow. He had small, lucid days where he named the trucks and their routes. He had bad days where he slept and drummed the bed covers, like someone waiting for orders. The hospital staff grew to know us. A nurse named Layla became our quiet ally. She would slide him tea and make small jokes. She called me Miss Hart, with the affection of someone who knew what family duty required. My father and I began talking like men and women exposed to loss. He confessed rarely, and in broken sentences, mistakes he had made in trust. "I trusted the wrong people," he said once, and it was the only confession I ever got. No self-flagellation, just recognition. Madeline called sometimes. Oliver texted less. We attended hearings and board meetings. I slept in a small room off the office to be close to the call of the business. My friends called less. People will call when you are triumphant. They will call less when the story involves bone and slow stitches. I started to write a book of sorts, an internal manual about what we'd done. It was less about lectures and more about strategies. How to spot shell companies. How to read petty invoices that hide vacations. How to create an anonymous line. It was an odd kind of memoir, meant not for glamour, but for repair. I hoped that other people could use it. In the quiet moments, I practiced small domestic things, baking for the nurses on a good day, learning patience with my father's slowness, walking with a cane like a man who had surrendered only a few of his battles. The yard behind the house became a place where I planted bulbs. I thought of flowers coming up regardless of the weather. It was a metaphor silly and apt. You plant, you water, you wait. When spring arrived, the city was the color of new money greens in parks, lighter coats. My father left the hospital in a wheelchair rolled by a man with a gentle voice. He was thinner, but his eyes still held the same clear geometry of a man used to maps. He liked to sit on the back porch and name things: trucks, people, places. He said, "This is enough." I wanted to be enough with him, and that was a small triumph. People asked whether we forgave. I found the question half kind and half impossible. Forgiveness is private, and often overvalued in public. Madeline wanted to reconcile for the cameras. Oliver wanted to rebuild the family brand. Clara wanted privacy and a legal strategy. Forgiveness requires acknowledgement and restitution. You cannot force another person into the work that must be done in their heart. At the company picnic that summer, I watched children chase a stray dog around the yard. Sol's daughter had a scraped knee and someone cleaned it. The small acts were now the center of what Heartline did. We had an apprenticeship program. We had a fund for workers' education. We made decisions that hurt fancy reputations, but saved real lives. My father attended a board meeting, flattened into a smaller man with softer speech. He said little, but he listened. He bought lunches for warehouse workers that week and joked about the steaks being too well done. He had the wry grin he used to have when he wanted to be both leader and companion. There is healing in domesticity. Madeline appeared at the picnic, awkward and withdrawn. We spoke without cameras. She looked older. "I was wrong," she murmured. "I was thinking of being seen, not being honest." "It's late," I said, "but not too late for small things." She cried a single large tear. It was not the repentance of saints, but the messy way humans unclench. I accepted it without fanfare. Forgiveness is practical. Oliver never returned in earnest. He took a buyout and moved to the coast, where the rents were lower and the sea abundant. He sent an occasional email about a startup. People follow the paths they make. Clara returned to a life with fewer galas and more quiet. She publicly apologized, not in a perfect performance, but in a slow, earnest column where she wrote about accountability. She started volunteering at a community center. She aged, as we all eventually do, into a woman whose public face softened into something new. I married, later than most of my friends, to a man named Daniel who loved my work and our small rituals. He was gentle in ways my family had never learned to be. He washed dishes without complaint. He drew maps of our weekend hikes. We were not a storybook. We were a pair of companions learning how to inhabit the small life that is not spectacle. He admired the work I did and never asked me for the ledger's details beyond what made him comfortable. I thought of the beeping sometimes, less as doom and more as a rhythm I would always recognize. It shaped my pulse like a foreign language. I could translate it now. You think that once the courts adjourn and the headlines fade, that the hard work is done. It is not. Legacy is not just about names carved in stone. It is the daily practice of care stitched into mundane task. Paying salaries, maintaining accurate books, holding town halls. It is about making sure the trucks run on time with a conscience attached. Heartline survived because of people who trusted the job to be done properly. I learned to hate spectacle and love the ledger. My father recovered enough to attend my wedding. He gave a speech with a voice that trembled but held. He said, "We are a flawed family. We have been dishonest with each other, yet there can be repair." He looked at me, and there was a softness there that had nothing to do with business. "You were fierce when I was weak. You were steady," he said, and the room listened because he had always been a man of clarity. In time, the charity became a model of transparency. It published monthly statements. Donors could trace funds. The organization partnered with community groups. It hired those who knew the neighborhood. It became less glamorous but more useful. There were fewer headlines. There were more lunches funded for elderly men who could not make ends meet. That counted. We set up a program in my father's name for the children of Heartline workers. I often sat with the kids and read aloud from books that hadn't been written to teach business ethics, but did anyway. Stories of courage, of small choices that mattered. The kids loved to argue about what they would do if they had to choose between silence and truth. There are worse debates than that. At home, I place my father's papers in a drawer labeled, "Do not touch." Not because they tempt, but because they are reminders. My father and I have long conversations about the future. He is quieter now, older. If asked, I might say the cost was great, but the return immeasurable. We kept the work stable. We found grace in small acts. We learned to speak truth without weaponizing it. We accepted the consequences of choosing repair over pretense. There were no neat moral bows. There were lunch times and dull paperwork, and the smell of engine oil when I visited the depot. There were voices that thanked me, and those who did not. That is the arithmetic of living. There is a small bench near the warehouse where I sometimes sit and look at the trucks. The drivers bring their thermoses and joke. I think of the hospital room, the beeping, and the way a woman's quiet can become a shield. The weeks where the news cameras circled my family are like a season that passed. But seasons are cyclical. Weeds find their way back into gardens if you let them. Once, when I was a child, my father taught me how to mend a broken window. He measured twice and cut once. He wrapped the frame with care. "Fixing things is not only for show," he said. "It is to make what is useful last." There will always be people who choose style over substance. There will always be those who pick image over integrity. But there are also people who decide to tend what matters. The drivers, the nurses, the people who feed the world when it keeps itself too busy to notice hunger. If you asked me whether I regret the path I chose, cutting the lines that tethered my family to performative charity, I would say no. I regret the moment my father had to be the patient, learning to be mortal. I regret the pain of watching people be exposed, but I do not regret the choice to do honest work, to choose the ledger over the gala, to spend energy where it changes someone's day. My father died 3 winters after the hospital bed and the beeping. He died with his hand in mine. We had reconciled in the quiet, in explanations and small apologies and simple acts. The funeral was small, appropriate, and honest. People cried. People shook hands. We planted bulbs in the backyard that spring in his name and watched shoots take their time. I still water them. Sometimes I look at the photograph of him from years ago, the man in his study with a map. I smile with a kind of delicate affection. He trusted me with an incision. I made the cut clean. The repair took longer than anyone wanted, but it lasted. This is not a story with a moral, so much as it is a ledger entry in the book of our lives. We were given a chance to choose. We chose to save the work of the people who rely on the everyday, to set boundaries, and to define love as something that includes responsibility. In those choices, there was restitution, and in restitution, there was the slow, patient growth I had once thought impossible to cultivate in a family so splendidly skilled at defending its appearances. If you ever find your seat at the table missing, look first at why it was removed. Sometimes the answer is cheap and quick. Other times it is the beginning of a necessary, painful repair. If you can, do that repair. If not for them, then for the people who will inherit the trucks and the lunches and the unspectacular obligations that make daily life a human thing. The beeping is memory. I hear it still sometimes when I wake at night. But now, when I listen, it is not a clock of dread. It is a drum whose beat reminds me how to move to act, to sign, to repair. The sound is softer now. It is the measure of a life that learned to account for what matters.